to the team.
Hello, thank you so much, Jessica. Steve Persh here, Director of Technical Marketing at Pantheon. We'll go around the horn real quick and let our panelists introduce themselves before we get into discussing this idea of JavaScript eating the web. Fatima, let me toss it over to you, another Pantheor. How are you doing today?
Good, Steve. Good to see you, and good to see Ben and Sally again. I'm Fatima. I'm a developer programs engineer at Pantheon. I work on our developer relations team and manage our open source repositories. I'll pass it over to Sally.
Hello, nice to see you all too. I was just thinking the last time I saw you all was probably here last year. I'm Sally Young. I'm based in London in the UK, and I've been working at Lullabot for about 10 years. It was the first Drupal agency. And I started building decoupled sites around 2012, and I'm a Drupal core committer for JavaScript maintenance.
Excellent. And Ben, how about you?
Hey, my name is Ben Morse. I'm a developer advocate at Google. I've been here for a while now. I worked at AOL before that, the New York Times. I used to do music. You can see that thing's my office, actually my attic of my house over here. Not really an office. In the attic, music stuff. Now where I spend all my time. My job at Google is to work on the web, helping the web to be beautiful and fast for people everywhere.
Well, excellent. We've got this topic here, a prompt just in the session title of JavaScript eating the web. So I'd like to go around the virtual room here and get your reactions to that verb of eating. Has JavaScript eaten the web? And if not, what's a better verb to describe what JavaScript has done, I'll say in the last decade in particular, to the way websites are used and built? Anyone want to go first? Has JavaScript eaten the web? Ate the web, I should say.
So I think JavaScript hasn't eaten the web because it always was the web. It's always been there since we've had browsers, and for a while it was not very cool to have enabled on your website. Sometimes for good reasons, but it's the language that we have in the browser, so you can't really avoid it. But leaning into it, you can create all sorts of amazing experiences. So it's been pretty cool to see everyone leaning into it and making all these amazing apps and cool stuff these days.
So what do you think would be a better description of what JavaScript, or maybe more productively asked, what has the JavaScript community done in the last decade to the way websites are built? If the JavaScript community hasn't eaten the whole of web development, what exactly have they done in the last decade?
Sorry, Ben, go ahead.
You go ahead. I'll follow you.
I think knowledge sharing has definitely skyrocketed. I think if you search for learn to code these days, then often JavaScript will be your first port of call, and it's because having an environment to do that in is really easy because everyone has a browser. And I think we've also done some great work on standardizing on frameworks to actually do things, to manipulate UIs, for example. So React being like the classic example. I don't know if any of you have ever tried like manipulating DOM nodes by hand several years ago, but it's never been fun. So yeah, there's like lots of lots of solutions out there now, which just make all that stuff a lot more powerful and easier, and it can get a lot more people further faster.
Yeah, adding to that, I think the reason we're all here is, as Sally has been saying, JavaScript was always there, but it was used for little things before. It was used for like, oh, you're rolling over this button, change the color of the button when it gets rolled over. And it didn't do that much. And then it began to explode into this massive ecosystem. I mean, there was Ajax many, many years ago now. People began to use that to make web apps, which was impossible before. It was kind of like static sites. Now you have things like Photoshop moving to the web and Google Docs, all kinds of crazy things that are web applications. And even for static sites, even for things made by CMSs, which is relevant to our current discussion, more and more things are being done in JavaScript. People are making CMSs with Node. The server is JavaScript. And also migrating lots of the logic from the server over to the client. So there are sites out there where everything gets calculated by JavaScript in people's browsers and stuck on the screen by JavaScript. So instead of just having HTML, which you serve, and some CSS, which I encourage the styling, JavaScript does more and more to make things happen. So this is really kind of fun for developers and gives you flexibility and all kinds of nice things. It makes deployment easy. One possible downside is speed and accessibility, because not everyone out there has the fastest devices or fastest connections or most powerful devices. So if your site requires a megabyte of JavaScript to actually load up and then get parsed and execute before anything displays on the screen, it'll be slow for some people. And there are those out there who will never see your site at all because their device can't handle it, period. Or it might take like 10 or 20 seconds to actually load the JavaScript and execute things and make them happen. So there's an interesting balance here between what the developers want to do, what users actually want.
Yeah, and Fatima, going to you, I'd like to hear about your experience, some of our shared experience at Pantheon working with various web teams that are navigating those trade-offs that Ben is highlighting. Like, yes, there is potentially a higher ceiling for a user experience that's significantly better, and yet there are many more ways of going terribly bad if you rely on a megabyte of JavaScript coming over a slow phone connection before your website can do anything. Like, in your experience, how are real web teams out there in the world navigating those challenges?
Before I answer that, I have a word for you.
Right, yes.
I was going to say JavaScript has inspired the web, because that's sort of what I'm hearing from Ben and Sally. As for web teams, I think what we've experienced and what I've experienced working with web teams to get them on decoupled architectures is that the developer experience right now is really rough. And so talking about the user experience being easy for them is like far out, because we're getting them up and running, getting them familiar with React, getting them familiar with JavaScript or whatever components that they're using is always a big struggle. And a lot of web teams, I think, get really excited about this idea, but aren't sufficiently like equipped with documentation or training or the knowledge to be able to use the different pieces that we're putting together for them. And so I think that's something that's important, like building some form of training, documentation, or we talked about a pattern library yesterday. That would be really cool, because that would help them see like scenarios or ways that they can use that for their website and be able to do that in a more building blocks way, instead of, there's this wide open field and they don't even know where to begin sometimes.
I think that's a good transition to Sally and your work in this decoupled initiative specific to Drupal. Like, how does Drupal as a community handle the challenges that Fatima is highlighting in order to keep Drupal as useful, as tangible, as flexible as it has been historically?
That's a good question. So I got involved in the decoupled menus initiative, having worked on the admin initiative before, which is now defunct. And we sent out a survey to find out what people would actually want from this, and we had a lot of discussions about it. And so when Dries first announced the initiative, he wanted a React component, I think, for the initial deliverable, and we talked about it a lot and decided that's probably not going to work for most people, because most people are going to have custom styles and all kinds of other things in their sites, and we can't really dictate how those things are going to click together. And are we going to maintain components for Vue, React, and Ember, and web components, and all kinds of things? And the answer is probably not. So we decided what would be better was be providing documentation. So just like a really good place that you can come to on Drupal.org and have like proper code examples and nice little embeddable widgets that let you run things in the browser, and a really good explanation for how to do menus in just that one item. And then we'd start expanding that with other areas of Drupal as we go along. So it'd also include things like, how do you deal with multilingual, and all kinds of those like frequently asked questions. So we'd be kind of providing a bit more of a starter guide or a starter kit, as opposed to like, okay, here's a component, okay, thanks, bye.
Sure. And Ben, I'm curious from your perspective, what is the threshold or bar that any one website or Drupal as a community has to clear in order to stay competitive with either other CMSs or just the wider web as a whole? How good does it have to be? And what's your view on how the Drupal community or any one web team gets there?
That's an interesting question, and perhaps everyone should give their answers to this question because it's been discussed so long and in so many ways, and there's so many different ways this has been answered. I mean, people have developed metrics since I got involved in JavaScript, which was a couple of years ago, about how to measure how fast is fast enough. And the answer is, however fast is fast enough. But I can tell you that Google is working really hard to standardize this and make it easier to measure. If you're aware of Core Web Vitals, which Google came out with last year after discussing performance with many people from many places, and everyone got together and found these 3 metrics seem like good ways to measure things. They'll get updated every 6 months as the web changes and as measurement improves. They're called, oh my God, now I'm blanking. This is a really embarrassing moment. Largest contentful paint and cumulative layout shift and first input delay. You can go to web.dev/ what are those? I guess there's
web.dev.
Yeah,
is a URL I've been to before, I think.
That's a good one. And there's also URLs for the different metrics there, web.dev/LCP and so on and so forth. They give you some nice scientifically tested ways of measuring whether your site is going to be pretty good for users. Most sites don't meet the metrics that they're supposed to in all these cases. But for me, honestly, what it's always been when I've gone and talked to people that have websites and looked at them with them, it's not that hard to actually do, in my opinion. You just go to your favorite browser. If you're using Chrome, you can go to DevTools. You can throttle the network to like a fast 3G connection, throttle the network, and load the page up with the cache off and see how fast it loads. If you're staring at a spinner for 10 seconds, that's not going to be so good. The nice thing, though, is that with these new measurements, there's also this nice thing called the Chrome User Experience Report. Actually, there's anonymized data that Chrome collects on users and gives you real-world data. So you actually can find out how fast your site displayed, how fast things became interactive, how stable was the layout for actual real-world users. That's super useful. You can get these results from various tools like Lighthouse and PageSpeed Insights. Pardon that long answer. I actually want to ask the question of Fatima real quick before I forget this question. Fatima, you were saying that people are struggling to learn these new ways of making sites with JavaScript. And I hadn't thought about this before. Are people out there not familiar with React still, and all these new ways of making things are involving a learning curve?
Yeah, so we primarily work with like Drupal or WordPress sites that want to move over to a decoupled architecture. And so we'll have this meeting where the purpose of the meeting will be for me to help them turn over a page into a React component and work with them. And we want them to drive that meeting because we want them to really get into the code and be able to make those changes. But what often happens getting into those meetings is they have no idea what they're doing. And, since they're driving, I'm kind of like, that's a component. Oh, no, don't edit that. And so it becomes a really interesting experience where they're also learning how React works and how the DOM works. At the same time, they're also learning how to use JavaScript to change something on their site. And so it's kind of like a very intense experience, especially for developers that may not be familiar with JavaScript before that. And so that's kind of what I was alluding to, that the patterns that Sally mentioned, if we had a page where people could just copy something and play around with it, then they wouldn't be so lost when they're starting out.
Are they people who are already developing on their Drupal and WordPress sites?
Yes. Often the context here is Pantheon is encouraging teams that are deeply rooted in Drupal and WordPress. In some cases, running a nearly decade-old WordPress site. How do you convert that to a decoupled architecture or a Drupal 7 site? One option that I've heard many times is we're going to take our gigantic Drupal 7 site, we'll migrate it to Drupal 9 and relaunch it in Gatsby all at once. And that sounds to me like an incredibly risky thing to do. So there are a lot of ways that could go wrong. And if your baseline assumptions are that if we decouple the website, it's going to get faster and more people will click on the buttons we want them to click on, and our front-end developers and back-end developers and designers will all collaborate better together because they'll all be more familiar with having a conversation around a React component. Well, like, you got to check all of those things. Like, any one of those things might be true, but for any given team, any one of those things or all of those things might just not be true at all. Like, Sally, I know Lullabot launched one of the first, if not the first, React front ends for a Drupal site. Like, lullabot.com became a React site, and then you went to Drupal 8 and dialed that back, realizing like, oh, we used to have a situation where like the 50 Lullabots all could contribute to our own website because it was just Drupal and everyone knows how to work with a just Drupal website. But when we made it a React plus Drupal site, it reduced the number of people who could work on the site to like 3 people. And that was a regression.
Yeah, definitely. And it was also in the days before stuff like Docker was popular. And so, you know, it's already hard enough getting someone's Drupal local setup at times to then, on top of that, be like, oh, and now you need this whole other stack, and you need those 2 stacks to communicate on your local. Maybe you can point it to these other places, but yeah, it gets really complex really fast.
Yeah. So
we shouldn't forget also that, like, today's like really cool new thing, the grass that's greener across the fence, will be like 5 years from now that old thing. We're like, why did we do that? So the shiny new thing isn't always the best thing. And the JS community, every 6 months, every 1 month, there's something really cool and that comes out that's like the latest amazing thing. Wonderful area of growth and innovation. But you don't have to follow every trend, though. You can follow certain trends, not all the trends.
Yeah. So I think it's got a lot better with that. Like, you know, React's been out for years now. So like, I definitely feel the churn less. But I feel like there's lots of things in the JavaScript community that maybe haven't been looked at as deeply as in others. Like, you know, we've been doing CMSs for a really long time, and Drupal can get complicated because we're trying to solve really complicated problems. So, you know, I see lots of cloud CMSs come out, or things that are written in Node, and yes, they're good at those, the subset of things that Drupal is currently doing. But when things start to get more complicated, like, oh, okay, now you need it to be multilingual and do this, that, and blah, 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 and revisions and everything, then it's not necessarily as mature as like a air quotes legacy system.
Yeah, so with a legacy system, or, you know, a vintage perhaps system, Drupal is now 20 years old or thereabouts. There's a lot of really good stuff in Drupal, and a question I've been asking for years is like, if we're going to headless Drupal, if we're cutting off Drupal's head, then what is Drupal's neck? And I think we have answered that question well enough. JSON API and GraphQL are like the community agreed upon necks. Like, either if we need to do a thing with a headless Drupal site, like, either that thing needs to happen before you get to JSON API and it's happening in Drupal, or it's happening after JSON API. It's happening in your front end code base, whatever the thing is, be it styling or, you know, date formatting. If you want a date formatted in a certain way, you can do that before or after JSON API. But the question I really want to get to here, Sally, sorry, I'll let you jump in on the question of where is the neck. The question I want to get to is what is the heart. But first, you may have something to say on where is the neck.
Yes, there's still lots of things missing, I guess, from that part of the stack. And like, often when I've done decoupled sites, quite frequently end up with a node service that sits in between Drupal and the front end site. And the reason for that is because when you change your content model in Drupal, then your API suddenly shifts, and you either have to do some kind of magic to deploy everything at the same time, which is tricky, or you need to provide some kind of backwards compatibility. And the other thing that's kind of missing is a bit of a tooling layer. So GraphQL is something cool, but in the JavaScript world, like, the tooling that's available for GraphQL and fetching data and doing all that stuff is really amazing. So sometimes it's easier to stick like Apollo GraphQL or something in between Drupal and your front end, and then it could just manage all that stuff. You don't really have to worry about it so much. So it's just like a really long giraffe neck.
Yes, exactly.
With a bunch of stuff.
You might need Apollo server in between Drupal and your Apollo client. But Sally, I think part of the reason I wanted to go down this road is because you were talking about revisions and multilingual capability, which I would consider to be like very close to the heart of Drupal. What do you, Sally, consider to be the heart of Drupal?
The entity system.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the way you can click together a content model rapidly is amazing, and it's not just a simple content model either. You can have references to lots of other places, and you get that admin UI straight away, and it saves a lot of time. And re-implementing user login systems, for example, is really boring, so no one wants to keep doing things like that. So I'm quite focused on Drupal's content editing capabilities and content modeling capabilities. I don't personally use so much of the settings tray and edit in place kind of stuff.
Sure. Fatima, I'm curious, what would you consider Drupal's heart to be? Technological or social, perhaps?
Oh, you just changed the question. I already had an answer.
I did. You can stick with.
Now I feel on the spot.
Well, that's what makes it exciting for us.
Clearly, I have to say community. But I was going to say I've had really good adventures with the form API. I feel like I have a lot of fun building forms in my agency days, and like being able to basically build anything in whatever the client would ask, but to a level of complexity, but you could go deep enough in the form API that you could build it.
All right. Well, maybe we'll get back to form API, time allowing. But Penn, I'm curious if you have thoughts on what is the heart of Drupal, or what should Drupal not leave behind if it decouples itself or evolves over the next decade? What should Drupal retain?
I've used Drupal to make sites, but it's been a little while, so I'm the wrong person to answer this question. So I'll be brief. I'll answer it anyway. But just my sense is that it's one thing is the knowledge everyone has about how to use Drupal, which is quite vast, and you don't want to toss that out. But also, I remember when I used Drupal, it had one of the best and nicest looking admin UIs that I had seen, where things looked pretty and they were easy to use for even the non-programmers, for the marketers to add images and add text and so on. Those things are nice. So I would keep that around.
All right. Sally, I think you're one of the people who will do that. Who will make sure you don't lose those parts.
I also have come to really appreciate owning my own data. And my clients appreciate owning their own data too, and not being, the freedom to move between hosting providers, for example, and not being locked into, very long, expensive contracts with CMSs that they come to not like so much sometimes. Sure.
Well, we're coming close to the end of our time here. I think we've got 5 minutes, so maybe time for just one last question, one last trip around the group here. Any closing thoughts, calls to action, or advice for those listening, and anyone who wants to take this question first? For those listening, what do you want them to be thinking about for the rest of the con and the rest of the year as it relates to JavaScript? Sally, you're the only one not on mute, so I guess you get to answer first. What do you want people thinking about in terms of JavaScript and their own adoption thereof?
Don't be afraid of it. I know making the leap from like PHP to JavaScript can seem like a lot, and especially when you go into a whole new ecosystem and a whole new community, it's really scary. But just stick with it. There's tons of resources out there. It's really rewarding. Don't feel like you have to dive into the biggest project ever. Like, start small. You'll get there.
Great. And Ben, how about you?
Just take out your $signs, and you've got fewer functions to work with, and you've got JavaScript. I'm going to repeat what I said before. Basically, was as you're doing your wonderful, exciting, fun JavaScript-based site, just check how much JS is being loaded and where and when it's being loaded. Is it all going to block visible content? Can you delay some of it for longer? Can you make your bundle smaller? Is it being minified? You know, how fast is your site really? And then also consider the idea that if you're making a mostly static site with like text and some images, some menus, then really you can have almost no JavaScript. So JS can be used to make it easier for you, but consider doing server-side rendering so you're serving less stuff to the user. You can use JavaScript, just use it judiciously. Like if you're putting salt on your food, don't dump the entire pound of salt in your food.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot shared in that advice. Like, not only should you be considering sending less JavaScript, but as Sally said, like maybe start small with a smaller project. Maybe don't try out all this new stuff all at once on the biggest project at your disposal.
Take it easy.
Yeah. Fatima, how about you?
Not much to add to that, except if these things sound really exciting to you, there's contribution going on all week. And I learned from Sally yesterday that instead of building your own patterns and documentation and JavaScript stuff at your agency island, why not come and work on it together? So the Decoupled Menus Initiative is doing a lot of work this week, and you should join them.
Awesome. All right. Well, we have, I think, time for any remaining specific plug. So yes, get involved with the Decoupled Menus Initiative. Sally, any more specific plugs or asks?
Yes.
Getting involved?
Come to our party, which, I think it's right after this call in 15 minutes. It's the Lullabot Scavenger Hunt, and it's in this like 16-bit RPG, and you can walk around and run into people and have video chats, and it's the closest thing you'll get to being at a conference. And I think if you go, I guess the easiest way is go to our Twitter. And there's a link on there. You can go in.
All right, check out the Lullabot Twitter. Ben, how about you?
I'll see you at the scavenger hunt.
Yeah. Any other things to plug? Web.dev as a Google resource.
Web.dev is good, and do something fun today. Life is complicated these days for lots of us. Stuck at home, scavenger hunts, meet people, do something fun. Be kind to yourself.
Yeah, and after this, I'll be headed over to the Pantheon booth, hanging out with our new senior vice president of product. And then I don't think I'll be able to go to Lullabot Scavenger Hunt because I'll be doing Pantheon Decoupled Office Hours.
I can go with Steve Persh because I can customize my sprite as much as I want.
That's true. Nothing's stopping you. You can go as a facsimile of Steve Persh. That could be fun.
It goes on for a couple of hours, and if people are still hanging around, we'll keep it open. So pop in.
Sounds good. We are at the end of our time slot. I don't know if a virtual hook is going to come pull us off stage. I don't know. The chat is telling me that I'm going to get hit with the ban hammer. It's just like the old IRC days. I'm going to get booted from the channel, never to be seen again. Well, thanks everyone for watching.
Thanks for having me.